Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Cheesus Speaks. I'm here today with, I'd like to call him a hero of mine. He's director and producer of the documentary The Aristocrats, author of Satiristas, and he's host of the hit show The Green Room with Paul Provenza, which premieres its second season on Showtime this Thursday, July 14th. Here he is, everybody, Paul Provenza. How you doing, Paul?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
You're
Can
one
I
of
just
my.
say that if I'm a hero of yours, you got problems.
Well, yeah, man. I've loved your work ever since. Well, I first heard about you when I watched The Aristocrats, and I'll tell you what, man. I've seen it probably 100 times, and me and my buddies just cannot get enough of that movie. Cause I mean,
Awesome. That's great.
it's
Did you guys check out the extras? Did you check out the DVD extras?
No, I haven't
There's some really great stuff in the extras. It's a few pages deep.
really. I
Yeah.
I really like Bob Saget tears it up in that, and who else? Gilbert Gottfried was just amazing too. His take on it.
I got to tell you, listen to the commentary track. The commentary track for the movie is just me and Penn watching the movie together and commenting as it in real time on what went on and all different things. Listen to the commentary track during Bob Saget's extended riff. This is a really funny story about Bob in there.
I'm definitely gonna check that out, man. That movie is. What gave you the idea to even do that?
It's just something that Penn and I had laughed about a lot. How funny Gilbert and Bob Saget are doing it. And I told him I'd heard other people do it, and we were just goofing around for a long time about how fun it would be to just have a bunch of different people telling that joke. And we thought that would be fun to do, just to give to some friends and just say, want to see something really ridiculous. But then Penn got into jazz in a big way. He started playing upright bass, and he's become really impressive with it. And we were talking about how the similarities between comedy and jazz are so great, but you can't really see it because in jazz, musicians will always do their own take on a standard, but you never really get to see that in comedy. And so we were talking about, well, what if we did the Aristocrats thing in that way? If we had, we found that made that a standard that a lot of comedians can do. And we just started going back and forth on it, and it was just the perfect timing. And we said, well, do you really want to do this? And I said, yeah, let's do it. And before we knew it, we were shooting. I called a bunch of friends, and the first night we shot a bunch of people, which was like Bobby Slayton and Kathy Ladman and John Ross, who's the guy in the bathroom. He's the guy in the men's room.
Oh, yeah.
And then we were doing it at the Improv, so we were just bouncing around, just for proof of concept, just to see what it would look like. And then we ran into Emo Phillips, and he said, man, I want to do it too. It was great. So we got Emo that night. And after that first night of shooting, we looked at the footage, and we just said, there's something here. So let's just keep going and see what happens. We didn't start out intending to make a movie. We started out just to see what happens.
Really?
And again, before you know it, we started calling friends. We got friends in the can, and then we started calling people who were sort of like the next level of friends. I mean, more acquaintances, and some of them jumped on board. And then when we called people like George Carlin, we knew that if George Carlin was into this, that we could get a lot of people into it. And before we knew it, it snowballed, and it turned into a full-on movie. We really thought we were just going to have something that we could show friends.
That's got to be the best documentary I've ever seen, too. It's completely amazing to me that you have so many, such a variety of different comedians all talking about the same joke, which is...
Yeah, it's one of the things that it's something that comes up in a lot of the work I'm doing, Satiristas, Green Room as well, is that, people have a very rigid idea. Everybody has their own rigid idea of what comedy is, the comedians they like, the stand-up that they whatever. And, what I've been trying to do in all these projects is really expand people's attitudes and awareness of comedy and how really big and broad it can be. That's why we have the magician Eric Mead, who's a brilliant close-up magician. He does the card trick version. With Billy the Mime, who's really dark and sort of like he bills himself as a mime for people who hate mimes. All these different people, because that's really comedy, and the more unexpected it is, I think the more interesting it is. So we try to include a lot of different expressions in hopes that people would see it and think, well, comedy is much more expansive than I ever imagined,
I tell you, the one with the mime is my favorite too. That guy Billy the Mime, he tears it up when he does that. When he does the
Billy the Mime, his solo show is unbelievable. It's high art. He does mime pieces that it's so disconcerting to see because you're not sure if you should be laughing or not. But he also has, I mean, it's really compassionate. His values are really strong. But he does pieces called A Day Called 9/11, where he basically does a mime version of somebody going to work at the trade towers that morning, and he intercuts it with a terrorist getting ready to go and do his job that day.
Oh, wow.
Really challenging kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The priest that calls the boy, he does JFK Jr., and there's a great Billy the Mime piece in the DVD extras. He does a mime piece called The Abortion, which is just amazing. So Billy the Mime is one of those people hear mime, they're like, ugh, mime. But Billy's a cat who just said, mime's way more interesting than people have made it into. And so he just turns his really, really interesting comic eye on a lot of funky things. It's great. It's really special. I mean, the audience is in the strangest place. They're laughing and feeling bad about laughing. They're not sure when to laugh. It's really great.
And another thing I noticed about the different varieties of comedians there are is nobody in Satiristas could really, nobody could really agree on, it seemed like to me, what satire was in general. There wasn't.
Yeah, that's another thing that also in the green room, a lot of issues come up, a lot of discussions take place, but we don't really care about resolving them.
Right.
Excuse me, I had a little postnasal drip today. A lot of things come up, and we just sort of let the dialogue happen, and there's no real point to make. And that's the thing that a lot of people feel in comedy they should be making a point, which is great for people. Mm-hmm. It's the kind of comedy I like to see. But in things like Satiristas and in the green room, it's more about the conversation. People don't have to agree on anything. There doesn't have to be any hard and fast right or wrong. Just the conversation, the dialogue, I feel like is enough. Because we don't see authentic, real exchange of ideas anymore. Certainly not on television. It's all filtered. It's all censored. It's all, there's an agenda on every show where, we can't go any deeper into this subject because we have to do this now. Mm-hmm. And so people don't see people really expressing themselves and just being free with that. And I think that's a big step right there, which I'm really proud of.
Yeah, that is pretty awesome.
And, we're not concerned that nobody on the show is concerned with being right or wrong. They're just going to have the expression, just going to trade the ideas. I think it's really cool. I think I really want to treat the audience, particularly on the green room, with a great deal of respect. Is just say, you know what, we're not telling you what to think. Think whatever you want.
That's another thing is in terms of what is funny to people, and like I mentioned to you earlier before we started about Tracy Morgan and the things he said, or just like with the Michael Richards thing. Is there a line to cross, and what is the line? Where do you draw the line?
Context is everything. There's a number of things at play. The Tracy Morgan thing, the Michael Richards thing is good just as a reference because, but in both cases, really, what it's all about, what this whole thing is about. First of all, the fact that comedians have to answer for jokes they do. That would be like, Picasso. I'm using an extreme example here. I'm not suggesting that Tracy Morgan is an artist at the level of Picasso. That ultimately doesn't matter. But the point is that if Picasso had to explain or justify Guernica or Damoiselle d'Avignon, if he had to explain or justify it or defend a point of view, well, that would be nonsense. It's the same thing with any art form. And by taking it out of the realm of comedy and treating it as if these are public figures whose ideas and thoughts are involved in public policy or something, that's craziness. I mean, no matter what Michael Richards said, no matter how wrong he might have been, and I'm sidestepping completely the real issue, which is, was he really expressing racism or was he trying something as a comedian that was failing? Aside from all of that, which are, who knows the answer to that, But
Right.
aside from all of that, how does a comedian end up being the poster boy for 250 years of racism in America?
Yeah,
And so there's something suspect about all of it,
there
And
is.
I think what it really boils down to is that a lot of people get offended and get really righteous about things when somebody says something that they don't like. And really what that is for the most part, that's people who are trying to make themselves feel better. Because somebody can really hold their head up high and say, you know what, I'm a moral, righteous person. I walked out on so-and-so playing at the Chuckle Hut because he said this homophobic thing. So I got up and I walked out. As if that means anything to anybody but themselves.
Yeah.
But they continue to go on and ignore the institutional racism of our justice system, the fact that, they're buying clothes and household goods made by children in countries that practice genocide.
The real shit.
They'll continue to play into the system and never actually address in any real significant way the bigger problems here. And they get a chance to say that they've done something, but then actually never have to do anything and make any sacrifices. And that's really at the root of a lot of this. The Tracy Morgan thing, every news story about the Tracy Morgan thing came off of one guy's Facebook blog.
Really?
Right? And we have no idea what anybody else in the audience thought, and we have no idea if this guy, the guy who complained about what Tracy Morgan said, maybe he's a dick. We don't know. Yet, it becomes this big, huge, conversation because people just like having those conversations to make themselves feel better. They can stand there at a party and just go, that Tracy Morgan, I'm never going to go see him. I never thought he was funny anyway, blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden they're big righteous moralists when they ain't doing shit in their own lives. And that's a big part of what goes on here. And then there are people with a particular agenda. This gentleman who was upset by Tracy Morgan. I'm not saying he's wrong about anything that he felt, but here's where it gets in. You can parse this in other ways, too. Like, for instance, Tracy Morgan is there doing stand-up, right? Mm-hmm. And we're now supposed to believe that Tracy Morgan is homophobic because he said these things about how he feels about gay people, right? But he's a stand-up comedian, and 90% of what he says just for the joke. He also says in that joke that he would stab his son if his son told him he was gay.
Exactly.
Well, we know that he wouldn't stab his son. We can accept that that's just comic hyperbole, right? Well, if we can accept that, then why can't we also accept that maybe he was saying something here for comic purposes? And it may not be funny, it may not have worked, but it's a comedy routine. That would be like having, it'd be like whoever wrote Silence of the Lambs being accused of being a proponent of serial killing. It's part of the artwork that is successful or isn't, worked or doesn't, but that's it. It doesn't go beyond that.
It seems like a large percent of audiences go there just to, bust people's balls about shit like that. And
yeah, and then plus also there's the particular time we're in, which is where we're all playing this big game of, tag, you're the asshole this week. Mm-hmm. Everybody with a camera has the chance to be, a celebrity for 15 minutes because they got a shot, they got a little video of Charlie Sheen puking on somebody's shoes in a bar. So all of a sudden, they're selling their story to the Inquirer, some buzz happens about it, they end up on websites, they're local celebrities, all their friends know that they created this big furor. A lot of this is all really, really about ego. It's about ego, and on the other side, it's about celebrity. Because there's comedians, 50, 60 a night, that have said things like Tracy Morgan says in comedy.
Worse things, even.
Yeah, but they're not celebrities, so nobody cares. And everybody can sit back and go, gee, I thought he sucked. I didn't like the things that he was saying. I didn't find him funny. And that's the end of it. But because he wasn't a celebrity, because Tracy Morgan is a celebrity, all of a sudden it matters. And that's really what it's about. It's about celebrity. And everything else is just rhetoric, not even healthy rhetoric. It's not rhetoric that actually opens up a dialogue. It's just a lot of people going, wow, people shouldn't say those things. And other people going, yeah, but he didn't mean it. And that's it. The dialogue never actually gets interesting.
Mm-hmm. And that's another thing is, another what I'd call a hero of mine is George Carlin. He would say that he'd cross the line deliberately, but he'd try to bring the crowd with him across the line.
Yeah.
sort of make them feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, because his values as an artist were to make the audience think, to make the audience, whatever it is that they're laughing at, to see if they have any responsibility in the silliness of that as well. I mean, those are all really, really great impulses for an artist to follow. So, his philosophy of it, he says, a comedian's job is to find out where the line is, cross it, and bring other people with him, because it's all a construct anyway. And people talk about the line or too soon, as if there's any definitive time or place that the line is supposed to exist. It's different for every single individual. So it's a crazy conversation to begin with. What it boils down to is you like that kind of sense of humor or you don't.
Right. And, and honestly, Carlin did make you think too, because I really credit him to giving me the balls to stand up and to I live in the Bible Belt here, and
he did that. He did that for me too.
Really?
And it's what Richard Pryor used to say. He said, the best thing that comedians do is give people permission. We give people permission to own the ideas and thoughts they have, not necessarily to say they're right or they're wrong, but just that they're not crazy just because they think or feel these things, Carlin gave me a tremendous amount of permission. I probably, our story is similar. If I was really into comedy when I was a kid, and when Carlin came along in his new incarnation, I was into comedy the way a lot of kids are into music, and start garage bands, and they just listen to every little bit of music they can. So when I heard Carlin in his new incarnation, that was like, I would imagine it was for some kid who was into the guitar, hearing Hendrix for the first time. It just was like, wow, there's a whole world of possibilities. And I heard him say all these things, and I thought to myself, you know what? Maybe I'm not crazy. He's up there saying these things, and thousands of people are cheering him. I'm not alone. It turns out I'm not the only one that isn't buying a lot of this bullshit. And that was really, really empowering for me, So, like any good, powerful art, if it moves you in a certain way, it generally moves you because it makes you think and really learn something about yourself,
Yeah, and so I know I've heard you talk about this too before, is whether or not, and you mentioned this a lot in Satiristas with different people, you guys talk about whether or not comedians can actually change a person's opinion, because they do make you think, and would they is there a possibility that they change people's minds, or maybe open someone's eyes to the light, to what's really going on?
Yeah, it's interesting. And in Satiristas, you'll find that most comedians tend to really downplay that for a number of reasons, really, that emerge when you read the book. It comes through in different voices, and you kind of get a real intuitive sense of what it is. But it's like, first of all, if you approach it as trying to change anything, you're kind of dead in the water, because it can't have that agenda. It can only happen, it can only happen if it's going to happen, but you can't, as a comedian, it somehow undermines everything if that's really your agenda. So there's that. And then there's the other thing, which is that, a big part of comedy is unpretentiousness and bursting the bubble of pretension. So a lot of comedians don't want to put themselves in the position where they're guilty of what they like to pop in other people. So, but Carlin himself said this, and Bill Maher also said this, and a number of people were free enough or saw this enough to actually talk about it. But the bottom line is that it actually does happen. It doesn't necessarily change policy or, big social movements happen. But Carlin talks about how people would come up to him all the time and say, you talked about this thing and it made me wonder about it, and I changed my whole view on it because it set, that idea going for me, and blah, blah, blah. And he said, I can't count the number of times that's happened. So he said, well, I don't care about that happening, and I do what I do for me. He said, I can't tell you that it does happen. I've had people acknowledge it. And I know for me, personally, it happened. I heard Carlin, I heard a number of other comedians, I heard Pryor, I heard a bunch of people, and it changed me. It changed my life, changed my way of being in the world. So in that sense, it does make a difference. It doesn't necessarily have any big scale impact, but what does?
You know
what I mean?
Yeah, and Colbert's a really good example of somebody who I actually know people, and you mentioned this in your book too, is people who take him seriously. You know,
Yeah, they don't see the irony in it.
I literally know tons of people that honestly believe the man's, a Bill O'Reilly type guy. He's a right wing
I know.
conservative.
It's so funny. I think to myself, the person that booked him for the White House press corps dinner must have thought that.
They had to.
They had to, right? Which is
Yeah.
even more hilarious.
Yeah, that's and
But that's another thing about certain comedy, certain aspects of comedy that I really, really like is I like when Patrice O'Neill said something last season on the Green Room that was so great. He said, people have the idea of comedy wrong. So people think that comedy means that everybody in the room is supposed to be laughing at everything. He said, but real interesting comedy, 50 people in the room love it and 50 people hate it. That's really interesting comedy.
Yeah, it's like if you don't piss off a few people, you might not be doing your job correctly.
Well, it also adds another level because people who appreciate it now have this level of being right next to people who don't.
Yeah.
And that's sort of another level of dissonance that's like it's funnier to people who do get it. It's funnier how the people who don't get it. That's another level of funny.
It isn't, but you'd be amazed at how many Republicans back Stephen Colbert. They love the guy because he supports their beliefs.
Yeah, they don't get that he's mocking it.
Exactly.
He's really putting that message out there. But, there's some truth to that as well. Ben Stein, noted conservative, and actually just made an awful documentary about intelligent design being taught in school.
I watched that.
Yeah, it's just full of holes and awful manipulation things.
I always like to watch the other side. I always like to hear the other side's story.
Oh, absolutely. I'm the same way. I purposely watch and listen to the things I can't stand because it's like I want to understand how they're processing everything. What is it that they really do, But anyway, Ben Stein, I brought him up because he said something very interesting to Will Durst, who's a great political comedian in the San Francisco Bay Area. And Will's been around for decades. He's one of the greats, really. And he said that Ben Stein came up to him once and he said, you keep making jokes about George Bush. Please continue doing that because every time you do that, you humanize him.
Oh, wow.
So that's one of the things that I bring up in Satiristas a lot to a number of people. I had a really interesting conversation with Andy Borowitz from the Borowitz Report online about this, about how, are we just playing into the narratives? We go out there and we do jokes about this stuff that they're already talking about. We should be going deeper. We should be getting out of the narrative to show what other narratives there are that we're not getting, So by picking up the narratives that are already in place, aren't we just adding to the problem of the same old distraction?
Right.
So we have some really interesting conversations in Satiristas.
The book's totally amazing because I read a lot of books by comedians, and I've never come across one before that actually, where you're questioning comedians about their craft and this.
Well, thanks for saying that. That means a lot to me that you see it that way because it's not a journalistic Q&A kind of thing. I mean, I really did have conversations. We just had conversations, and I picked and chose parts of them that resonated together or had some interesting through lines. So again, it's like everything I'm doing from the Aristocrats to Satiristas to the Green Room, it's I want to show the discourse. I don't want to tell anybody anything. I want them to be as if they were listening to this conversation or they were there for this piece of conversation and let them interpret it how they want to, let it move them in the ways they want to be moved. So Satiristas is more of a sort of intuitive thing. People walk away feeling a lot of different things, which is, I think, the best kind of work that I could possibly do. And the photography also is beautiful. The whole book springs from Dan Villon's beautiful portraiture in that book. The idea of treating the conversations/interviews the way they were treated with this sort of intuitive, feeling-oriented process rather than literal all sprung from Dan's photography. I thought, what can I do text-wise that is as evocative and as interesting and as sort of compelling without any specific, because he goes out of his way to make sure that when he photographs comedians, that they're not in wacky, zany settings, they're not, posing, they're not doing wacky things to the camera, because he wants you to feel things about them that aren't just about them trying to make you laugh. And so that really is where the text comes from, and the way it's written is really it's based on those beautiful photographs of Dan Dion's.
Do you feel like the green room is sort of an extension to Satiristas in a way? In a
sense. I mean, it's definitely swimming in the same end of the pool. It's not literally an extension, but it's definitely the whole behind the scenes vibe of the Aristocrats and the whole informality of it, and the fact that it's shot on consumer cameras and there's nothing slick and we didn't do any special lighting and we weren't looking for a set or anything, in the sense that all those elements are true for the green room as well, that it's more about the experience than the production. Because every time when a comedian sits down in a makeup chair and gets makeup and they got to tweak the lights and all this and all that, you just added layers and layers of artifice. Mm-hmm. It keeps you further away from authenticity. So in that sense, the green room is very much of that same philosophy of just let's see what's real and what's happening, and we shoot it in a way that's very different. I've always been frustrated as a comedian, both on television and watching comedy on television. Mm-hmm. I've always been frustrated that the greatest things about comedy seem to get lost on television. It's a lot like when you watch a band on television. You always feel like, well, you can kind of just judge the song. That's a nice song, it's not a nice song, but you miss the entire experience of being in the room with live music and all these people around you being interpreting the music and having their own experience with it. That's all part of the whole experience. And that never happens with comedy. And one of the things that you lose with comedy on television is a certain spontaneity and a certain unpredictability and a life, a real vibrancy seems to get lost because it's always the comedian has to stand here and the cameras are over here and don't move too far over there and the camera will go from a one shot to a two shot and a two shot to a one shot. So we shoot it with all handheld cameras, and the camera guys are told that basically, what you're shooting here is not a talk show. You're shooting sports or news.
Well, and I got to tell you, when you watch that show, you're in the room with you guys. You know what I mean?
That's a feeling that we tried very hard to convey. I'm glad to hear you say that. We wanted the cameras to just be ready to catch whatever happened because we don't want people to be confined by, the cameras don't need to be there. Cameras can do whatever they want to do. The whole way they've been doing comedy on television has always gotten in the way of what's really great about comedy. So we just said, well, why does comedy always have to adapt to the needs of television? Why don't television adapt to the needs of comedy? And that's what drives the shooting on the green room.
And the other thing is editing. Once it goes through the editing room, I can't remember who it is in the book that said, there was something that they completely changed his message when they edited it. I think it was Doug. Yeah. Was it Doug Stanhope? Maybe.
Yeah. It was Doug Stanhope. He said at the taping they just got all these people who weren't really fans of mine. They just got free tickets to something, and they figured they'd come and see it. And he goes, and I come out and I go, hey, I guess all my fans are here tonight. The crowd goes, yeah! And he goes, what's my name? And only 25 people in the crowd knew who he was. And he wanted that in. He wanted to make a comment on the fact that he knows he's doing something that's bullshit right now, but I'm going to do my show for you anyway, because that's Doug. He can't help but speak the truth. And they cut it out, of course. And he was like, those phonies. Phonies.
That is bullshit.
Yeah. Well, something, again, I'm really proud of about this show is this is the only comedy show where myself as a comedian, I'm involved in every process of it. So everything is vetted through somebody who really knows comedy. And so it's edited with an eye towards, I know what this rhythm is that's happening here. I know what, so you don't have to, it's not just some techie who's making decisions that are about how great this comedy is going to work or not.
So
and it's really, there is no other show on television, there's no other comedy show on television where a stand-up comic is actually vetting how the comedy is being presented.
Yeah, and there's a lot of relation. I see a lot of relation, and you mention it a few times in the book, between punk rock and comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you Can you elaborate on that a little bit for everybody?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is informed by when I came up in comedy. I came up in comedy, I was very young. I started doing stand-up professionally at the age of 17.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're talking mid-70s. And the comedy of the early 70s that I developed, and steeped myself in was countercultural. It was post-60s. It was really subversive comedy. It's the era that spawned National Lampoon, Saturday Night Live, ultimately, National Lampoon Radio Hour. Monty Python was beginning to come over here and find a following. Derek and Clive came over as bootlegs. They were these improv radio tapes that Peter Cook and Dudley Moore had done under the names of these characters, Derek and Clive, and they're just rude and vile, and they never planned to release it. They were just goofing around, and they never planned to release it. But tapes got out, and they were, the Rolling Stones brought them over on their plane. They were all, the band was all listening to this stuff, and they made copies and spread it all over. So all of a sudden, Derek and Clive was everywhere, which is really dark and subversive stuff. There was just Richard Pryor had just broken through. Carlin had just gone through his transition and broken through. So the predominant movement in comedy was really subversive and countercultural. And so when you look at comedy, became institutionalized, and it became a branch of the entertainment industry, really, in the 80s. When the boom happened, and now all of a sudden in every strip mall there was a Subway sandwich shop, a TGI Fridays, and a comedy club, and so comedy became one of those kind of products and standardized to appeal to everybody. You had a lot of people doing that, a lot of TV shows only going down that road, and mostly everything else kind of made its own way through, like weeds coming up through the cracks in the concrete. So there is a real question that any comedian who considers himself an artist or is just sort of adventurous will have to ask themselves the question: am I creating merchandise or am I making art?
Right.
And if you're making art, you can also sell merchandise. People might actually really like it, and you might actually make a lot of money really doing it. But you have to make that choice to make art. If you want a top 40 single, then you better be doing Britney Spears shit. If you're not interested in top 40 and you just want to make the greatest music you can make, you don't have to play by any of those rules. And so that's kind of the punk element to it. The punk element is also, we're the ones, the comedians. There's of course the fool, the one who could say to the king what nobody else could say to the king, because he could make him laugh and he knew the king wasn't going to take it seriously, but he'd still hear it. That goes back through history. That happened in ancient Greece with the group of 60, who were a quasi political group of people whose job it was to mock the Senate, to mock all the politicians. And they were embraced by the politicians, who then took all of that mockery and it informed the way they conducted government. It was part of the democracy. The Hopi Indians have the Heyoke, who are they're kind of spiritual, and they're every year in almost a religious ceremony. They have a day where they make fun of everybody in the tribe, and then afterwards the tribe gets together, the village gets together, and they examine all the dynamics that the clowns had pointed out to everybody.
Wow.
So there is a rich history of the comedian having a social purpose like that, and there's a certain punk aspect to being the ones who are going to speak the truth when it's quote unquote inappropriate to,
Yeah, because
that's what's so great about when politicians go on the Jon Stewart, go on the Daily Show, and Jon Stewart really asks him the real questions that you can't believe somebody's finally asking this guy. When that stuff happens, that's really the best of comedy in the punk sense. It's just do the thing that you're not supposed to do, if it feels right. If if you're just being subject to values that are nonsense.
Yeah, he does, and he tends to really call people out on their bullshit. And Bill Maher's really good at that too. I saw him.
Bill Maher is remarkable. Bill Maher more than all of Colbert, Jon Stewart, Louis Black, all those people. Of all of them, I believe Bill Maher is the ballsiest. I mean, Bill Maher will not back down, and he will not soft pedal it. He doesn't care if, as we already know, he doesn't care if the advertisers aren't happy, and he'll pay the price for that, which in his case turned out to be better, But I mean, he never pulls a punch. He really doesn't. He sticks to his guns, right or wrong. Whereas the others, they have to play more of a network television game. So there is a little bit of softening around the edges. I'm splitting hairs here because their work is still pretty stunning. But Bill Maher is a guy who will, he'll roll up his sleeves and throw down.
And it's all about what, like you said, what network he's on. Where he's on HBO, he gets away with a lot more.
Yeah. And boy, he's funny. And a lot of what makes the stuff funny is you just can't believe he's saying it.
I don't know if you caught Ann Coulter on there the other night or not.
I didn't, but I have a kind of a history with Ann Coulter.
Do you?
Yeah, we both did Politically Incorrect years ago when Maher was still on ABC.
Oh, no kidding.
And we ended up in a fight in the green room afterwards. We were wrestling on the floor. And then about a year ago, I did Red Eye on Fox, and Ann Coulter was on as well. And she didn't remember the incident from before, but this time around, she ended up changing her seat. She couldn't sit next to me and all this sort of stuff. And I was voted the absolute worst guest ever on the site, which I wear as a badge of pride and honor.
I thought, what's the kid's name, man? I've just recently heard about this guy. He's always on posting on George Carlin's official Facebook, and I know he was.
Great, by the way, tell your fans to sign on the official George Carlin fan page.
Definitely.
On Facebook. It's run by George's daughter Kelly, who is also a producer on the Green Room this season. And it's not your typical fan site. It's really great.
It is. You post a lot of.
Are you talking the young comic that you're talking about? Is that Lee Camp?
Lee Camp, that's him. Yes.
Yeah, I thought it might be because Lee was on season 1 of the Green Room as well, and I ran the clip of him on Fox News. Where he actually, and this is pretty punk, seriously. It is a great example of punk in comedy. They brought him on to comment on some story. Every once in a while they bring on a left-wing comic to make jokes or whatever, and they play a little, whatever. It's a little chatty, nothing TV nonsense, fill time for a 24-hour network crap. And they brought Lee on. I guess they really didn't know what they were doing. They didn't really know Lee. Because at one point in the middle of them asking him for some cute joke about something, he just goes, wait a second, can I just say something here? What is Fox News exactly? It's just like a parade of propaganda, isn't it? You guys just make stuff up, and it's such a great moment. And, of course, he got thrown off. And
never asked back, I'm sure.
Yeah, no. And I ran that on the Green Room so we could talk about it.
And, guys, you can actually check that out on YouTube, too. That clip's widely available on YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's that's the kind of thing that's like and that's the thing about comedians. Why comedians are able to do it because most of us are really loners. We became comedians because we had a particular or a very singular kind of way of looking at the world. So most comedians come from not a very gregarious background. A lot of times you sit alone and think, and you really develop an individual voice that way. And so when Lee does something like that, that's just like he doesn't care who doesn't like him because of it. This is a country with 300 million people in it. Anybody that wants all those people to like them is just some dick.
Exactly.
Really, do you have any balls? Do you have any identity of your own? Do you have any what? How bland and uninteresting could you possibly be? And the real artists in comedy know that not everybody has to like you. And unless you're really greedy, you don't have to be as big as the Blue Collar Comedy Tour. That's not necessary to do really great comedy and actually make a fine living and have a decent life, staying true to yourself. You know, and that's what I love about Lee. He's like, and politicians can't be that way. Journalists can't be that way. You know, people who work for big networks can't be that way. Comedians can. Comedians can just go, I don't give a fuck what you think. I really don't care.
They truly they're in the position where they can speak for everyone that can't speak. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I'm also really pleased with about the response to Satiristas, the book, is because a lot of people found it like almost self-help, like reading all these voices who basically say, I can't not say these things. Maybe it's something wrong with me, but I just have to say these things. There are a lot of people who really in their lives, they shut up a lot more than maybe they should. And people have said it's really been like empowering, you know, to hear it from so many different voices that they admire, to just go, you know what, there's actually a lot of, for whatever price you pay, by telling the truth and being honest and being your own man or woman in this world, for every bit of price you pay for that, there's also great rewards. So it's a question of what you care more about.
Now you included Jello Biafra in this book too.
Yes, yes, of course.
What was I mean, now he's not a comedian per se, but you consider him a satirist?
Well, I do actually, but here's the thing: he's not a comedian per se. But also you have to remember that Henry Rollins is included in this context in Satiristas.
Right.
Because Henry Rollins has a number of multiple CD releases, like 2-3 CD sets of spoken word.
Yep.
And it's very, very funny. I mean, he is essentially a comedian. He doesn't call himself a comedian. If he chose to call himself a comedian, nobody would think twice about it if that's what they knew of him. And also he has that, I mean, since we talk so much in the book about a punk sensibility, and a lot of people are surprised to find out that Craig Ferguson actually started as a punk rocker, musician, and then began doing comedy as the punk rock character that he had created in his punk rock music days. He performed, his first stand-up was done under the name Bing Hitler. So there is a rich, connection to the whole sort of punk mentality, which is really, I'm talking about a subversive mentality. But so Henry Rollins was in the book and made sense. And Jello Biafra is really just a slight shift over, because if you look at first of all punk rock really is subversive satire. I mean,
right.
The Sex Pistols and Malcolm McLaren in Decline of Western Civilization, they talk about how they were really show business. Like the whole idea of the Sex Pistols was a music hall kind of comedy gag, which doesn't take anything away from everything else it was, but they were very aware that they were putting on a show, And Jello Biafra with the Dead Kennedys, first of all, look at the name of that band. Look at his name, Jello Biafra, and the names of the other people in the band. I don't remember offhand. But there was a very satirical element to the fact that they were even doing what they were doing in music. So there's that. There's a little bit more sophisticated look at the comedy aspect of what it is that they do. But also, their songs are very darkly, subversively satirical. Mm-hmm. And they ended up in a major First Amendment case, because they actually were victims of Tripper Gore's Parents Music Resource Center. They were arrested. Their place was ransacked. Their offices were ransacked.
That's absolutely fucking
go to court
crazy.
Defend their First Amendment rights as musicians.
Wow.
And that they had to do that as musicians is because they were satirically subversive in all their work. And that's why Jello Biafra's in the book.
And the same thing happened to Carlin and Lenny Bruce, right?
Exactly. If the Dead Kennedys weren't really dealing with a very sophisticated satire, mm-hmm. then they wouldn't have been a threat to anybody. Nobody who cared what they were doing or saying.
Yeah, and It's another thing that strikes me is, I could be wrong on this. I'm sure there's plenty of right-wing comedians, but it feels like that the majority of comedy or comedians these days, or maybe since forever, for all I know, it seems like it is more leaning towards a leftist approach. Or these.
Well, It tends to be about freedom. It tends to be about personal choice.
And questioning.
It tends to be about humanity. It tends to have a compassion for the victims of power and control, you know. And I think that is, for the most part, a universal in comedy, because as human beings who look at the world a different way, being born into this bizarre world, looking at it from a different viewpoint, almost all comedians have felt alienated, which is why they're such good comedians.
Right on. And
so they tend to, they tend to do work that is in favor of breaking down constructs, breaking down assumptions, all the things that people believe without even questioning, because they've been questioning their whole lives, and it's been a hassle. That's, I think, that's my theory as to why it tends to be predominantly kind of lefty. And also, comedy is very much, there's a lot of chaos in comedy. Even the most well-crafted comedy, even just a brilliant, say, Stephen Wright haiku-like joke, is really just controlled chaos. He takes two really bizarre ideas that you would never put together yourself and puts them together, and that's sort of the kind of chaos that creates little big bangs of ideas, So chaos, which relates to anarchy, which relates to the political left, see what I'm doing there?
Yeah.
Is kind of inherent in comedy in general anyway. They're different from music, which tends to be about things connecting in ways that make sense. That's what becomes, we sort of relate to and we feel in our bones. That's what music has generally been about, whereas comedy has always been about taking chaotic ideas and combining them.
Yeah, and I gotta say, another guy that I'm really glad that you got to include in this book is Greg Giraldo, who his comedy
is a little creepy, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's a little
it is.
Creepy. What he says in there, he goes, I'm saying this all right now to make it easier, so you can just cut and paste it and put it right into my obituary.
Yeah, he does say that. Stuff. And he almost had his own style of comedy too. His approach on things were a little different, and
yes, for sure.
He was very original.
The beauty of it was unique to Greg, and you couldn't even say it's like this, or you couldn't even describe what it is, because it just had to be Greg doing it,
Yeah.
The big tragedy of his death in terms of comedy is that he was really just finding his voice. He even talks about that in Satiristas. He talks about how he's in a place now that is different than he was a couple of years ago, and that's what happens. It takes a long time for a comedian's voice to really season and really become comfortable in his own skin or her own skin. That's why people like Sarah Silverman are such extraordinary artists, because Sarah Silverman was basically who she is now right out of the gate. She had a very clear sense of what it was that she was doing, and essentially the character that she's playing on stage, which a lot of people don't realize. But she's doing a character act. She's the closest she is to anybody in comedy is to Stephen Colbert.
Yeah.
But she had it figured out right out of the gate. She knew what she was about, and that's remarkable, And then you have a guy like Bo Burnham, who's a 20-year-old phenom who's really brilliant, and he's just enjoying exploring all the different possibilities for himself right now. It's really interesting to see what different talents and different gifted people do with the limitations and possibilities of the form.
Yeah, and can you give us I know this season on the show you're having Judd Apatow and Mark Maron. You did have Bo Burnham's on there, right?
Yeah, let me see, because the combinations are really, really interesting. That's a lot of my creative input on the show, is particular combinations of people. And the first show is Gary Shandling, Judd Apatow, Ray Romano, Mark Maron, and this 20-year-old phenom, Bo Burnham. Really interesting show. Goes to places that you'd never expect a comedy show to go to. Yeah. And it's really funny along the way. And then we have another show with Kathy Griffin, Greg Proops, Dana Gould, and the great Franklin Ajayi, who I'm proud to reintroduce to a lot of people, and particularly young people who've never heard of him, because he's an icon, really, particularly in black comedy. He was like the flip side to Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor was this big, bottle rocket performer, and Franklin Ajayi was much more thoughtful and literate,
Right.
Really great comics. So that's a group, and we that one is so authentically a green room. We actually end up lighting up a joint, smoking it, sharing it in the middle of the show.
Oh, no kidding. Is there? Do you actually? How do you go about choosing who's going to be on an episode together? How do you decide?
Well, there's a lot of parameters. There are certain. Showtime wants to make sure that there's some promotable names on each show. So
Right.
there's certain people that we have to put on a show together. And then I look at those combinations and I think of other people that would play well with them. It's a lot like, it's easier to understand when you think about music. It's like if you could put together your dream band,
Yeah.
you take a guy from Blind Melon, you take this guy from Pearl Jam, you take this guy from The Who, whatever, and I think, wow, that would be cool to hear them jam. That's what it is for me.
Wow, that's awesome, man. You really have a dream job, you know that, Paul?
I know, it's great. This is the greatest. I could do this show forever. It's the first time I've ever really felt like I'm being authentically me on television.
Yeah.
And that's a great feeling. And it's spreading to everybody else on the show, too. Let me tell you some of the other lineups, which are phenomenal. Lewis Black and Ron White and Kathleen Madigan and another young phenom, Jamie Kilstein. This guy is working like he's like if Allen Ginsberg did stand-up comedy, he would be Jamie Kilstein. And he's got an amazing podcast called Citizen Radio. This podcast is so hip. He has people on, everybody from like Sarah Silverman with like Matt Taibbi and like Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky's done the show like 5-6 times. Howard Zinn did it a bunch of times before he passed away.
Wow.
It's like this. It's like a punk news comedy show. It's the coolest podcast, Citizen Radio. So he's a really interesting cat, and to put him on with Ron White,
You put them together. Oh wow.
Yeah. And it was great. It was great. Everybody was surprised. You thought you knew anything about Ron White. You thought you knew anything about Lewis Black's politics. You thought you knew anything about women comics. It's like the whole show is just surprise after surprise after surprise.
That's awesome. I cannot wait.
Then we have another show with Margaret Cho, Richard Lewis, Jeffrey Ross, and a young comedian who was actually born in Pakistan named Kumail Nanjiani. And he's just fantastic. And, that ended up being like Richard Lewis asking Kumail things like, all right, so in the Quran, is there any point in the middle of all this beautiful spirituality and everything, is it just one line somewhere on page 280 that says kill the Jews? Is it just one? And it became a real question about the Quran. And it was hilarious, and it's the kind of conversation that you'd never actually see people have on any news show about this. And like we all learned like loads about Islam, and it was unbelievable. I'm telling you, I'm so proud of this season. I really am. And then we have another show with Tommy Chong and Joe Rogan and Eddie Ift, a brilliant comedian who I know from the international circuit, and Rick Shapiro, who I don't really know how to describe Rick. He is the most jazz-like comedian working today, I think. It's really, man, you're in for a roller coaster ride with Rick Shapiro. It was great. And that became, Tommy Chong talked about his drug bust, and it was hilarious. He was talking about SWAT teams out in front of his door, and he could see the glass. They looked like trick-or-treaters. I couldn't believe I was getting busted by SWAT teams. And it's just really funny, true, honest stuff. It's really great. And then one of my favorites of all time is a show with Dave Attell, Richard Belzer, Doug Stanhope, Janine Garofalo, and Glenn Wool, a Canadian comedian who's one of Stanhope and Attell's favorites. And that was another one that really felt like such a green room. At one point, I even got up to go take a leak because I didn't have to be there. It was like a real green room. Yeah. And people were having conversations. Doug and Janine were having an argument about some work that she did years ago, and blah blah blah. It's about as if you want to know what it's like hanging out in a green room. That show to me is like the most authentic. Like everybody just forgot that we were making a TV show.
It really does capture that sense of reality, because like I'll point out in season 1, for instance, like when Penn Jillette and Tommy Smothers had a little spat on the Yeah,
and so that spilled over too, because Penn did a video blog about grappling.
I watched that. He was so upset.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, and that's real stuff going on. It's not none of it is.
He really was. Tommy really challenged him, look at something in a way he had never looked at it before.
Because he was friends.
Yeah, and I thought to myself, that's a cool. I'm very proud of the fact that Barbara Roman, my co-producer on the show, and I and the team we have with us, just everybody is consistently on top of making sure that we're being authentic at every step of the way. And I just feel like, it's not often that you have a comedy show that ends up, with a 10-minute video blog of a philosophical idea in response. It's really cool. It's really fun. And our audience is so interesting. Like on the Green Room fan page, the Green Room Show fan page, Kelly Carlin is on there. A bunch of the comedians who are on the show are on there, and real conversations happen. And it's not like a typical fan page where it's like, "Hey, we got a new DVD out. Spend your money. Buy this." It's not just promotions. It's really people are really interested in the stuff that we're doing. So go and sign up on that fan page. It's really, really fun and interesting.
I will do that, and I want to also point out that something with Kelly Carlin, man. She really touched me in a way, touched my heart in a way. I was in a rehabilitation treatment program, and I'm having a lot of problems with the whole 12-step thing. And I know Penn Jillette had even done an episode on AA is bullshit and all that. And,
right.
And Kelly, I had asked her because I knew George had went into rehab at one point, and how I'd wondered how did George, if I don't know if he had to go through a 12-step program or not, but if he did, how did he personalize that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. And you know what? Just for you personally, you might appreciate this. American Atheists has some literature on rehab programs, and so ways that, like, if you don't believe in any sort of a deity, how can you have? Because there is a real Christian streak through AA, and so they have this literature to where you can sort of work with what you need to, how to sort of, not have to buy into that kind of stuff to get help from the program, so you might find that interesting.
Also, and what was that called again?
Well, it's American Atheists.
American Atheists.
It's the organization that puts up those billboards that always get press when they're defaced, and people go, like, they shouldn't put billboards like that. That's un-American, all that sort of stuff. They put up billboards that say, like, a lot of people don't believe in God. They're okay. You're okay, kind of things,
I believe I've seen one of those in D.C. before.
And there's always some controversy about them, and somebody gets all up in arms about it and everything. And their response is always like, I see Christian billboards all over the place.
Exactly.
I don't see the problem. At the Christmas season, they put up like a nativity scene, a billboard with like a nativity scene and everything like that, and it just says, it's just a story, right?
That's awesome.
Yeah, they're really fearless, but they do that to create dialogue and to bring people who are feeling oppressed by religion in the world, in this country right now, sort of embolden them. But they also engage in a lot of litigation, to keep separation of church and state, and fight against intelligent design and promote science education, things like that. They're a very important organization, and they do defend everybody. What they're doing is just, it's good for everybody. They're not saying anybody should not be allowed to believe whatever they want to believe, but we have to keep it away from, everybody else,
Yeah.
So they're a good organization, and they have literature about 12-step programs, about how you can possibly still get help from them without having to, basically sell your reason and intellect.
Well, I'll have to definitely check into that. And, Paul, before I let you go, man, I want to thank you again for speaking with me today. And it's really...
It was such a pleasure. It was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
And everybody check out The Green Room with Paul Provenza. It's the second season starts this Thursday, right? July 14th at 11 o'clock?
11 p.m.
11 p.m.
Showtime.
All right.
And it'll be on demand, too, so...
All right, Paul. Well, I hope I get to speak with you again, man. It's really been
All
a
right.
pleasure, man.
Anytime, brother.
All right, you have a good one, buddy.